It started as nothing more than a favor, something so small I almost said I'd do it later. My friend called, asking if I could help his auntie fix her old laptop. I pictured a quick visit, a few clicks, maybe a restart, and then I'd be on my way. But the moment I stepped into her living room, with its warm light and faint smell of tea leaves, something in the air felt different. She greeted me with a gentle smile, the kind that seemed to carry both kindness and loneliness in equal measure. The laptop sat on the table, its screen flickering stubbornly, but her eyes, soft, searching, were fixed on me instead. As I began to work, she watched quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for more than just her computer to be repaired. And then, in a voice so calm yet so unexpected, she asked, "Can I fix you something too?" For a moment, I forgot the keys under my fingers. Something about the way she said it made the room fall still, as though the question was about more than tea or food, and I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The day began like any other, with no sign that it would leave an imprint on my memory. My phone buzzed in the middle of a lazy afternoon, and when I saw my friend's name on the screen, I answered without much thought. His voice carried that familiar casual tone, but underneath it, there was a hint of urgency. "Hey, can you do me a favor? My auntie's laptop is acting up again. She really needs it fixed, and I told her you're good with this stuff." I hesitated for a moment, staring at the clutter on my desk, thinking about the work I still had to finish. It didn't sound like much, just another errand I could tick off quickly. I told him I'd go over in an hour, and he sent me her address. I didn't even know her personally, only heard about her in passing. She was, in my mind, just my friend's auntie, someone's relative, someone else's story. But sometimes, the smallest decisions take you somewhere you never expected. The streets were quiet when I arrived, with that stillness that comes in the early evening, when the sun hangs low and paints everything in soft gold. Her house stood near the end of the lane, modest but well kept, with a small garden out front. The paint on the gate was chipped in places, and there was a wind chime by the door that tinkled faintly in the breeze. I knocked, expecting the usual polite greeting, maybe a quick smile. But when the door opened, I was met with a warmth I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't tall, her back slightly bent with age, but her eyes, those eyes, were full of life, a soft light that seemed to search right through me. She greeted me by name as if she'd known me for years, and motioned me inside without hesitation. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and something older, like well-kept books and polished wood. The furniture was simple, but there were little touches everywhere, crocheted doilies, framed photographs of smiling faces, a clock that ticked steadily on the wall. On the table sat the laptop, its lid open, the screen dim and flickering like a candle struggling against the wind. She gestured toward it with a faintly apologetic smile. "It's been giving me trouble for weeks," she said softly. Her voice was gentle but carried a weight, as though she was used to not asking for much from others. I sat down and began to work, fingers moving automatically, but part of my attention was already on her. She sat across from me, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching with quiet curiosity. At first, she didn't say much, just little comments about how she'd tried turning it on and off, how sometimes it would work for a while and then freeze again. But every now and then, I'd catch her eyes lingering on me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that felt searching. It was as if she was trying to place me in her world, trying to see beyond the surface of what I was doing. I told her a few things about what might be wrong with the laptop, but I could feel she wasn't really interested in the technical explanation. There was something else she was holding back, something she wasn't saying just yet. Minutes passed in a comfortable kind of silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the machine as it rebooted. I could hear the faint creak of the house settling, the wind brushing against the windows. Every sound felt amplified, as if the air between us was charged with something unspoken. Then, out of nowhere, she leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but clear, and said, "Can I fix you something too?" I paused, my fingers frozen above the keyboard, my mind tripping over the words. It sounded like such a simple question, the kind anyone might ask a guest, but there was a softness in her tone, almost a sincerity that felt too personal for such a small offer. I looked up at her, and for a moment, it felt like the room had slowed, the ticking clock in the background marking time in a different rhythm. I didn't know if she meant tea, food, or something I couldn't quite name. But her eyes held mine, and I could tell this wasn't just politeness. It was an invitation, quiet, open, and strangely disarming. I found myself struggling for an answer, not because I didn't want anything, but because I wasn't sure how to receive something I didn't yet understand. The air felt heavier, and in that pause, I realized this might not be the simple favor I thought it was. I told her a cup of tea would be nice, trying to keep my voice light, as if that moment hadn't unsettled me. She gave a small nod and disappeared toward the kitchen, her steps slow but deliberate. I could hear the faint shuffle of her slippers on the tiled floor, the soft clinking of cups, and the low hiss of the kettle. Left alone in the living room, I glanced around again, taking in the details I'd missed before. The photos on the walls weren't just decorations, they told stories. A younger version of her in a floral dress, holding the hand of a tall man with kind eyes. A group of children in school uniforms, one of them my friend, grinning awkwardly. A framed picture of a garden in full bloom, perhaps her own, with sunlight filtering through trees. Everything about this space felt lived in, cared for, yet touched by a quiet loneliness that lingered in the corners. When she returned, she placed a tray on the table with 2 steaming cups and a small plate of biscuits. She settled into the chair opposite me, folding her hands over her lap before lifting her cup. The tea smelled faintly of mint, the kind you brew fresh from the garden. "I'm not very good with computers," she admitted, a faint laugh escaping her, "but my husband used to fix everything. Light bulbs, radios, the washing machine, he even built a little shelf for the kettle because I said it was too low." Her eyes softened at the memory, but then her voice trailed off, and the smile faded slightly. She took a slow sip of tea before continuing. "It's been hard since he passed. Things break, and I try to manage, but sometimes," she didn't finish the sentence, letting it hang between us like an unfinished thought. I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. I didn't know her, but in that moment, I wanted to. I wanted to know the stories that lived behind her careful pauses, the memories she kept tucked away like fragile glass. I asked how long it had been since he passed, and her gaze shifted to the window as if the answer was written somewhere outside. 7 years, she said softly. You get used to the silence, but you never really stop hearing it. I didn't know what to say, so I let the silence sit with us, not rushing to fill it. She seemed to appreciate that. I went back to working on the laptop, my fingers moving over the keys with practiced ease, but my mind wasn't entirely on the task. The more she spoke, the more I realized she wasn't just talking to pass the time. She was opening doors she probably didn't open often. She told me about how her husband used to hum while fixing things, about the smell of oil and wood shavings in their garage, and how he always managed to make her laugh, even when she was angry with him. Her voice would brighten when she spoke of those moments, then dim again when she came back to the present. There was something in her tone that felt like an unspoken confession, that life had slowed down too much, that days could blur together when no one was around to share them. I kept listening, nodding occasionally, offering small words when they felt necessary, but mostly letting her fill the room with her memories. I could feel her studying me as I worked, not in a judging way, but as though she was trying to decide if I was someone she could trust with pieces of her life. I realized then that fixing her laptop was almost incidental. What she really wanted, perhaps, was someone to sit across from her and listen. The steady hum of the old computer filled the room, blending with the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the house. The smell of tea drifted between us, warm and comforting. Every so often, she would glance at my hands, then back at my face, and smile faintly, like she was remembering someone else who once sat where I was sitting. It made me wonder if I reminded her of her husband, or perhaps of a younger relative who used to visit before life got busy. I didn't ask. Some questions are better left for moments when trust has settled fully into place. Instead, I focused on making sure her laptop would run smoothly again, though in my mind, I was already beginning to understand that the real repair work might be happening elsewhere, quietly, in the space between her words and my listening. She excused herself for a moment, saying she'd be right back, and I heard her footsteps retreat toward the kitchen again. The sound of the kettle came first, then the faint metallic clink of a spoon against porcelain. A warm, earthy smell began to drift in, mingling with the faint lavender that seemed to linger in every corner of the house. It wasn't just tea this time, there was something richer in the air, a smell that made me think of home-cooked breakfasts and quiet mornings. I kept working on the laptop, but my mind wandered, pulled by the simple comfort of that scent. She returned carrying a small tray balanced carefully in both hands. On it were 2 cups of tea, slices of freshly baked bread still warm enough to let off steam, and a little jar of homemade jam with its lid slightly crooked, like it had been opened and closed many times. She set the tray down gently, as though it was something precious. "I thought you might like something to eat while you work," she said softly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether I'd accept. I thanked her, and she smiled, really smiled this time, the kind that reaches the eyes and makes them crinkle at the corners. We sat together, and I let the laptop rest for a moment while I reached for a slice of bread. The crust was firm, the inside soft and airy, and when I spread the jam, its sweetness filled the air between us. She watched me take the first bite, and for some reason, it mattered to her that I liked it. When I told her it was delicious, she looked relieved, almost as if she'd passed some quiet test I hadn't known was happening. We began to talk, not in the polite, guarded way strangers do, but in a way that felt like we'd already been speaking for hours. She asked about my work, about where I lived, and whether I had family nearby. I answered, though not with the short, safe answers I usually give. I told her about my parents living in another city, about the long hours I sometimes worked, and about the strange quiet that came when I got home late at night. I don't know why I shared as much as I did. Maybe it was because she listened differently. She didn't just wait for her turn to speak, she absorbed my words like they mattered. Sometimes, she'd tilt her head slightly, as if studying my face for meaning I hadn't said out loud. Other times, she'd give a small nod and let a pause linger, a pause that somehow made me feel less alone. She told me about her garden, how she used to spend hours planting flowers in spring and pulling weeds in summer. She spoke about the satisfaction of seeing something grow under her care, and how the garden had grown quieter too, now that she didn't tend to it as often. "It's strange," she said, glancing down at her tea, "how you can look at something you once loved and feel tired." Her voice was heavy but not bitter. I thought about the half-finished hobbies at my own place, the books I never finished reading, the guitar I hadn't touched in months, and for the first time I understood what she meant. There was a quiet sadness in realizing that sometimes, the things you love don't leave you, you just stop going to them. Between sips of tea and bites of bread, I noticed little details about her. The faint tremor in her hand when she poured the tea, the way her eyes seemed to drift toward the photographs when she spoke of the past, the tiny sigh she gave every now and then as if her body was letting out a fraction of the weight she carried. She wasn't a woman who complained or asked for pity. She spoke with honesty, but also with restraint, like she'd learned to hold most of her pain in her own hands rather than place it in someone else's. That, more than anything, made me want to keep listening. When I finally turned my attention back to the laptop, she didn't seem impatient or eager for me to hurry. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the steady rhythm of the keys, the small progress bar creeping across the screen. She asked a few questions about what I was doing, not so much to understand the technical part, but just to keep the conversation going. I realized that this moment, the bread, the tea, the slow fixing of an old machine, wasn't really about the laptop at all. It was about sharing time, about two people who had started the day as strangers finding some unexpected middle ground where silence wasn't awkward and stories came without force. And though I wouldn't have admitted it yet, I knew I wasn't in a hurry to finish. Not because the work was hard, but because when it was done, I'd have to leave, and a part of me already felt that leaving would be harder than I expected. The laptop was nearly fixed now, the screen steady, the programs running without the usual hesitation, but for some reason I found myself moving slower, checking things twice, even 3 times, as though I could stretch out the minutes. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did and decided not to mention it. Instead, she began telling me about her nephew, my friend, and the years she had spent helping to raise him. Her voice softened when she spoke about the days when he was just a boy, running through the garden with scraped knees and a smile too wide for his face. She told me how his parents had been busy with work, and how she had stepped in without hesitation, packing his lunches, attending his school plays, even staying up late to help him with projects he'd left until the last minute. "I suppose," she said with a small, wistful smile, "that's what family does. You fill in the spaces where you're needed." She paused after that, her eyes drifting toward the clock as if the ticking reminded her how quickly those years had passed. Then her expression changed, just slightly, to something more fragile. "These days, we don't see each other much. He has his own life, of course." "I understand." She said it as though she truly did, but the quiet ache in her tone told me it wasn't that simple. I wanted to say something comforting, but the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. So instead, I asked a small question, the kind meant to keep her talking. Did she ever feel lonely? She didn't answer right away. She set her cup down carefully, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the saucer before looking at me. "Sometimes," she admitted. "It's not the kind of loneliness where you have no one. It's the kind where people still exist in your life, but the spaces between the visits get longer. You start talking to yourself more. You notice the sound of the refrigerator at night, or the creak of the house settling. Those sounds start to feel like company." Her words settled in me with unexpected weight. I knew that kind of quiet, not in the same way, but enough to understand. Without thinking much, I told her about my own moments of solitude, about how I sometimes came home after a long day to a dark apartment, the hum of the street outside the only sign of life. I told her how I'd eat dinner in front of my laptop, the TV playing in the background, just to fill the silence. She listened without interrupting, her expression open, almost protective. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. It was a small gesture, but it carried more warmth than I expected. Her skin was cool, her grip light, but there was something steady in it, something that made me feel anchored. We stayed like that for a few moments, neither of us speaking, the ticking clock the only sound. I noticed then how different the air felt, denser, as if we had stumbled into a part of the conversation that went deeper than casual words. She finally pulled her hand back, but the trace of that touch lingered. "People think fixing things is just about knowing how," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's about wanting to." She gave a small smile, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the laptop anymore. Outside, the sky had shifted to a dull gray, clouds gathering in slow, heavy folds. The first patter of rain began against the window, soft at first, then more insistent. She glanced toward it and asked if I could stay a little while longer, just until it clears. I agreed without hesitation, though I told myself it was only because of the weather. The truth was, I didn't want to leave. The house felt warm in a way my own didn't, not because of the temperature, but because of the presence it held, her presence. I had come here thinking I was doing a favor, but somewhere between her stories, her tea, and the quiet way she listened, I realized she was doing something for me too, though I couldn't quite name it yet. I went back to the laptop, running a final set of checks, but I found my mind drifting. I thought about the man in the wedding photo I'd noticed earlier, about how she had spoken of him as if he were still in the next room. I thought about her garden, now untended, and about how her life seemed full of spaces waiting to be filled again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that I wasn't just passing through someone's day, I was part of it, even if only for a little while. The rain began as a gentle tapping, a soft percussion against the window that seemed almost soothing at first. But within minutes, it had grown into a steady, rhythmic drumming, blurring the edges of the world outside into streaks of silver. She glanced toward the sound, her gaze lingering on the wet glass for a moment before turning back to me. "It might last a while," she said, her tone light but carrying that undertone of hope I was starting to recognize, the hope that I might stay just a little longer. I told her I didn't mind, that my evening was free, and something in her shoulders seemed to relax. She got up slowly and walked over to a small wooden cabinet against the far wall. From it, she pulled out a tin, the kind that once might have held biscuits but now rattled with the sound of loose odds and ends. She set it on the table and began sorting through it, pulling out photographs, faded letters, and tiny keepsakes that looked worn from years of being handled. She handed me one of the photographs, a picture of a younger her standing in a lush garden, holding a basket overflowing with flowers. Her smile in the photo was unguarded, radiant, the kind of smile you wear when you're living inside a moment without realizing how much you'll miss it later. "That was the summer we decided to grow everything from seeds," she said, a trace of pride in her voice. "We had no idea what we were doing, but the garden didn't seem to mind. It was the happiest mess you could imagine." She laughed softly, but the sound carried both joy and the faint ache of memory. She began telling me about each object she took from the tin, a button from her husband's old coat, a postcard from a trip they'd never taken because life had gotten in the way, a scrap of fabric from a dress she used to wear at family gatherings. Each item was a doorway into a story, and each story was told with the kind of care you reserve for things you're afraid will vanish if you don't speak them aloud. At one point, she looked at me and asked if I had things like this, objects that held pieces of my life. I thought about it for a moment and admitted that I didn't, not really. I'd moved often in the past few years, and each move had stripped away a little more. Most of my memories lived in photographs on my phone, in digital files that could be erased with a single accident. She frowned slightly at that, not in judgment but in quiet concern, as if she thought I was missing something important. "You should keep things," she said gently. "Not because they're valuable, but because they're reminders. One day you'll need them more than you think." The rain grew heavier, the sound filling every pause in our conversation. She made us another cup of tea, this time without asking, and I noticed how naturally we moved around each other now, her placing the cups within easy reach, me shifting the laptop slightly to make room. It didn't feel like I was a guest anymore. It felt like we had slipped into a rhythm that belonged to something older, something familiar. She asked about my childhood, and I found myself talking about summers spent at my grandmother's house, about the smell of fresh bread in the mornings, about nights when the whole family would sit outside and watch the stars. As I spoke, I realized how long it had been since I'd thought about those days, and how much I missed them without even realizing. She listened with a soft focus, her eyes not just on me but on the places my words seemed to take her. Every now and then, she would smile in that quiet way of hers, the corners of her lips curving upward as if she recognized something in my stories that matched pieces of her own. I noticed that the lines on her face deepened when she smiled, not in a way that aged her, but in a way that made her look like someone who had truly lived. There was a calmness to her, a steadiness that made me feel as if the storm outside could go on forever and it still wouldn't touch us here. Somewhere between the tea, the rain, and the low hum of conversation, I realized I wasn't keeping track of time anymore. I wasn't thinking about the work waiting for me at home or the messages I hadn't answered. I was simply here, in this small living room, with this woman who had started the day as a stranger and was slowly becoming someone I didn't want to leave behind. When the rain eased slightly, she glanced toward the window again but didn't suggest that I should go. Instead, she told me about how quickly life seemed to move once you stopped paying attention, how one year you're planting a garden and the next you're watching it grow wild without you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth of them. I thought about my own life, the years that had slipped past without much to show for them except long workdays and fleeting weekends. I wondered if maybe, in her own way, she was warning me not to let the same thing happen. Or maybe she was simply sharing a piece of herself in the hope that it might mean something to me later. Either way, I knew I was going to remember this moment, the sound of rain, the warmth of her tea, the way her voice seemed to wrap around the room like a thread stitching two lives together, even if only for an afternoon. The rain had softened to a quiet drizzle by the time she rose from her chair and moved toward a small cupboard tucked away in the corner of the room. She opened it slowly, as though it held something fragile, and reached inside for a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. She carried it back to the table and placed it between us, her hands lingering on the lid for a moment before she opened it. Inside was a careful collection of keepsakes, old photographs, folded letters, and little trinkets whose value was written not in money but in memory. She pulled out a single photograph first. It was of her and her husband on their wedding day, black and white, slightly faded at the edges. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen before, eyes bright, head tilted slightly toward the man standing beside her. He was tall, with strong features softened by the warmth in his eyes. She handed it to me without a word, and for a moment, all I could do was study the two of them, frozen in that perfect instant decades ago. "He was my best friend," she said quietly, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of this room. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. He used to say, as long as the roof doesn't leak and the kettle boils, we're fine." She smiled faintly, but the smile wavered, and I saw the shadow of loss pass across her face. She went on to tell me little details, how he'd hum when fixing things, how he never let a Sunday pass without making her laugh at least once, how he could cook only one proper meal but made it so often that it became theirs. The way she spoke about him made me feel as though I had known him, as though he had just stepped out of the room and would be back any minute. She picked up the photograph again, holding it close for a moment before tucking it gently back into the box, like returning a precious object to its place of safety. I didn't know what to say, so I let the silence stay between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, if anything, it felt necessary, like a space where her memories could breathe. After a while, she looked at the laptop and noticed the progress I'd made. "It looks like it's working now," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, confirming that it was running smoothly again. But neither of us made a move to close it or talk about payment or thanks. The truth was, the laptop no longer felt like the reason I was here. She poured us another cup of tea, her movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. The steam curled between us, carrying the faint scent of mint and something else I couldn't place. We sipped in silence for a while, watching the sky outside shift from gray to the pale, washed-out colors that come after a storm. I could feel that unspoken sense of time running out, the awareness that I would have to leave soon, but I didn't want to acknowledge it yet. She told me then about how life changes in ways you don't expect, not with big, dramatic moments, but in quiet, almost invisible shifts. One day you're living in the thick of things, surrounded by people and noise, and the next, you realize the world has moved on without you." She wasn't bitter when she said it, just honest, as if she had accepted that truth but still felt the weight of it. I admitted that I sometimes felt the same, even at my age, and she gave me a knowing look that seemed to say she had been where I was once. When I glanced at the clock, I realized how long I had been there. Hours had passed in what felt like minutes. I expected her to tell me it was time to go, but instead, she began asking about my own life in a way that made me feel like she actually wanted to know, not just the surface details, but the pieces most people skip over. She listened to my answers without rushing, without checking the time, and I realized how rare that was. In that room, in her company, there was no hurry. The rain had nearly stopped by the time we finished our tea, but still, neither of us mentioned me leaving. She didn't ask, and I didn't offer. There was a quiet agreement forming between us, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken. It was as if we both knew that something had shifted during these hours, that we had stepped into a space neither of us had expected when I knocked on her door. I came to fix her laptop, but somewhere along the way, she had opened more than just the lid of that old machine. She had opened the door to a part of herself she didn't share with everyone. And without even realizing it, she had opened something in me too. The sky outside had taken on that pale, fading light that comes just before evening fully sets in, when the day is still holding on but the shadows are beginning to stretch longer across the ground. I knew I couldn't stay much longer, yet I found myself lingering, my movements slow as I closed the last program on the laptop and checked one final time that everything was running smoothly. She watched me from her seat, her hands resting on her lap, and there was something in her expression that made me think she knew this was the part of the day neither of us had been looking forward to. I finally closed the laptop lid and placed it gently on the table between us. "It should work fine now," I said, but my voice came out softer than I expected, almost reluctant. She nodded, smiling faintly, though there was a sadness in her eyes that told me she wasn't ready for me to leave either. She stood up slowly and walked with me toward the door. Her pace was unhurried, each step measured, as if she was trying to stretch the last moments we had. I slipped on my shoes while she stood nearby, her gaze not on what I was doing but on me, as if memorizing the way I looked in her doorway. When I told her I'd come by again sometime, I meant it, and I could see by the way her eyes brightened just a little that she wanted to believe it too. "You'll always have something to fix here," she said with a quiet chuckle. "Maybe not a laptop, but something." I laughed softly, but her words stayed with me, carrying more meaning than I could explain. As I stepped outside, the air was cool and carried the clean scent that comes after rain, fresh and almost sweet. The street was quiet, the sky now brushed with faint streaks of pink and gold. I glanced back at the house once before walking away, catching sight of her still standing there, one hand lightly holding the edge of the doorframe. It wasn't the image of someone seeing off a guest, it felt more like a goodbye between two people who understood something had shifted in them during the hours they had spent together. On the way home, my mind replayed fragments of our conversation, the way her voice softened when she spoke about her husband, the warmth in her touch when she rested her hand on mine, the quiet pride in her garden stories, and the gentle care with which she served tea and bread. I thought about the things she had said about loneliness, about the silence that fills a home when the spaces between visits grow longer. I thought about my own silences, the evenings when my apartment felt too big for just me, and how I'd grown used to that emptiness without realizing it struck me then that I hadn't just repaired a broken laptop that day. Somewhere between the careful clicks of the keyboard and the steam rising from her teacups, something in me had been repaired too. I didn't know exactly what it was, maybe a part of me that had gone dormant from too many hurried days and nights spent in isolation. Maybe it was the reminder that connection can be simple, that sometimes all it takes is sitting across from someone and really listening. By the time I reached my street, I could still feel the weight of the afternoon in my chest, but it wasn't a heaviness I wanted to shake off. It was more like the kind of weight you carry after hearing a song that stays in your head long after it's stopped playing. I knew I would see her again, not because of obligation, but because the thought of not seeing her again felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. And even as I closed my own door behind me and set my keys down on the counter, her voice still echoed in my mind, gentle, certain, and full of something I couldn't name yet. You'll always have something to fix here. It was a week before I went back. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I wanted the visit to feel intentional, not just an impulsive drop-in. In that week, her words replayed in my mind more times than I could count, especially when I was alone at home, the hum of the refrigerator my only company. You'll always have something to fix here. I didn't know if she meant the laptop, or something in her home, or something in me, but the truth was, she'd already fixed something I didn't know was broken. That thought pulled me back to her doorstep one quiet Saturday afternoon. I knocked gently, and when the door opened, her smile spread slowly, like she hadn't been expecting me but was deeply glad I was there. She stepped aside, and the familiar scent of her home wrapped around me, warm tea, a faint trace of baked bread, and something uniquely her. We sat at the table again, but this time there was no laptop between us. She'd already prepared tea, the pot waiting in the center along with a plate of biscuits that looked homemade. We spoke more easily now, without the cautious politeness of strangers. She told me about the plants in her garden, how she'd been trying to grow roses for years but could never get them to bloom as she wanted. I admitted that I didn't know much about gardening but would happily help dig or carry things if she needed. She laughed softly, that kind of laugh that starts small but lingers in the air. Then, her tone shifted, and she asked about my week, not in the casual way most people do, but in a way that made me want to answer honestly. I told her about a small project I was struggling with at work, about the restless nights I'd been having, and even about how quiet my apartment felt lately. She listened without interrupting, just nodding at the right moments, her eyes never leaving mine. At one point, she reached into that same wooden box she'd shown me before and took out a small folded piece of paper. It was a recipe, handwritten and slightly yellowed. She slid it across the table toward me. This was his favorite, she said, meaning her late husband. It's simple, but it made him happy. Maybe it'll do the same for you. I unfolded it carefully, reading the neat handwriting, feeling the weight of what she'd just shared. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a piece of her life, something intimate and irreplaceable. I promised I'd try it, though part of me knew I might never be able to recreate it exactly. The recipe was only part of what made it special, the rest was in the love behind it. We talked until the light outside began to fade again, the hours passing so quietly I didn't notice. I told her I was glad I'd come, and she smiled like she already knew that. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door again, her hand brushing my arm lightly. You fixed more than my laptop that day, she said softly, almost like she was telling me a secret. I didn't reply right away because my throat felt tight, but I held her gaze, letting the moment settle between us. Outside, the evening air was cool, carrying the smell of rain on the way. As I walked down her path, I realized the visits would become a part of my life, not because I owed her anything, but because I needed them just as much as she did. When I reached the street, I glanced back one last time. She was still in the doorway, just like before, watching me leave. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was carrying it with me, her kindness, her stories, her quiet way of making me feel seen. Maybe that was the real thing she'd been fixing all along. Not the machine in front of her, but the spaces inside me that had been quietly running down, unnoticed, until she came along and reminded me how it feels when something starts working again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who could use a reminder of how small acts of kindness can change lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me about the moment a simple encounter made a lasting impact on you. Your stories matter, let's keep them alive together.